The darkest sexual trials of the witch hunts whispers through time in the dim villages of medieval Europe. Where flickering candlelight inside the church symbolized salvation, fear and sin were weaponized in the name of faith. We know this terrifying age as the witch hunts. Behind prayers and hymns lay an unspoken obsession. Obsession with desire, sexuality, and guilt. Within the twisted trials of that era, women accused of witchcraft were not only charged with sorcery but forced to confess to forbidden pleasures. Imagined couplings with Satan, midnight pacts sealed in flesh, and even lurid encounters with their very accusers. The witch hunts are often remembered through images of fire, whips, and chains. But less often do we confront the fact that sex was at the very heart of many indictments. When church and state joined hands to control the lives of the faithful, the female body became a battlefield. Coerced confessions revolved around night-long orgies with demons, bodily contracts with the devil, and rituals in which pleasure itself was turned into evidence of crime. From the 15th to the 17th centuries across Germany, France, England, Eastern Europe, the trials became a theater of obsession. Desire was no longer a private matter, but a public threat, twisted into accusations of treachery against God. A woman who was too beautiful, too independent, or simply too different could be branded as a witch. And sex was the perfect weapon. Whispers that she bewitched men with her body, or that she lay with demons in the woods, could seal her fate. Picture a village courtroom, a damp, torchlit chamber where a bound woman trembles before judges and priests. Questions rain down. How many times did you lie with Satan? Did you trade your body for power? Describe everything. Leave nothing unsaid. Under torture, her body broken and bleeding, she eventually utters words forced into her mouth. And with that, the record is written. This woman consorted with the devil. This woman betrayed Christ with her flesh. These confessions, preserved in brittle ink, are less records of truth than chronicles of distorted desire. They reveal a chilling reality. Power in that age did not merely govern the soul. It claimed ownership of the body. By turning sexuality into a crime, church and state legitimized violence, converting pleasure into proof, flesh into guilt. Why, we must ask, was sexuality such a potent weapon in the witch hunts? The answer lies in the paradox of medieval faith. Desire was universal, yet condemned as the root of sin. In a society obsessed with purity, any trace of lust could be construed as a sign of demonic influence. Declaring women the brides of Satan satisfied both fear and authority, strengthening the grip of those who judged. In these trials, women were doubly victimized, by the superstition that branded them as witches, and by the sexualized narratives imposed upon them. Historical records suggest that inquisitors often derived perverse fascination from the interrogations themselves. Their relentless questioning about intimate acts was less about justice than about voyeurism under the guise of holy duty. Women's bodies were stripped, inspected, humiliated, stage props in a ritual of domination masquerading as salvation. The confessions often descended into grotesque erotic fantasies, feasts with Satan, orgies at midnight Sabbaths, or monstrous births of half-demonic children. Pain and humiliation unlocked stories shaped not by memory, but by the expectations of torturers. These were not true experiences, but collective hallucinations, forced into existence by torture and sanctified by parchment. Through this distortion, the female body became a site of communal fear, the screen upon which society projected its terror of uncontrolled desire. Women were burned not for what they had done, but for what others imagined they had done. The witch's body was never real. It was the invention of a world that could not reconcile itself with its own hunger. Thus, to study the darkest sexual trials of the witch hunts is to confront not only superstition, but the mechanics of power. Sexuality was turned into sin, sin into crime, crime into spectacle. The witch hunts reveal humanity's deepest fear, that desire. unchained, might overthrow the structures of faith and order. And so, countless innocents were sacrificed to preserve that illusion of control. As we open the door to these sexual trials, we uncover not only accusations of witches and demons, but a mirror held up to humanity itself, a portrait of how fear of the body, fear of desire, and fear of freedom can fuse into violence. The confessions may be centuries old, but the warning remains timeless whenever desire is shackled by guilt and wielded as a tool of power. Darkness will always rise again. Lust, sin, and the witch's body in the collective imagination of medieval Europe. The female body was both sacred and profane, life-giving and life-destroying. It nurtured the world, yet it also stirred desire, which the Church condemned as the lingering wound of original sin. From the moment Eve bit into the forbidden fruit, women were seen not only as the first to fall, but as the very carriers of lust itself. The female form was thus branded as the devil's most potent weapon. When the great wave of witch hunts spread across Europe, this belief found its darkest stage. The witch's body became the battlefield where faith clashed with fear. Texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous Hammer of Witches, did not merely justify trials theologically. They sexualized women as innately lustful, weak in faith, yet strong in desire, making them easy prey for Satan. Written by inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, the book argued with grim certainty. Women by nature were more carnal, more deceptive, and more dangerous to the soul. This doctrine did not simply reflect superstition, it created it, embedding sexual suspicion into every accusation. Imagine a small village in 16th century Germany. A young widow lives alone at the edge of town, her striking beauty whispered about in the marketplace. Men murmur that she visits them in dreams, seducing them in the night, leaving them trembling with sweat at dawn. These dreams, products of longing or fear, become public evidence. Soon gossip hardens into accusation. She must be a witch. She must be sleeping with demons. She must be trading her flesh for dark powers. In countless trials, the charges circled obsessively around sex. Court records reveal women coerced into confessing that incubi visited them in the night. They were forced into obscene couplings, that Satan himself claimed them in violent embraces. They were compelled to describe the unthinkable, forced to speak not their truth, but the fantasies of their interrogators. Under whips and iron, women confessed to attending demonic orgies, bearing monstrous children, or being branded by the devil during intercourse. But the obsession with the body did not end with words. Women's bodies became physical evidence themselves. During examinations, every mole, scar, birthmark was considered a witch's mark, the devil's kiss, the site of a pact sealed in flesh. Stripped naked, women were paraded before judges, priests, and villagers. Their skin was poked and prodded by cold hands, their most intimate places violated in the name of justice. What was this if not institutionalized humiliation, a ritual of possession disguised as law? In this grotesque spectacle, women were doubly dispossessed, accused of being the devil's lovers, and simultaneously reduced to objects of prurient scrutiny by the very men who judged them. Torture chambers became both courts and theaters, where voyeurism mingled with violence. The denial of sexuality transformed into its most obsessive expression. The confessions themselves often read like pornographies of the damned. Women, broken by agony, spun tales of feasts with Satan, of midnight dances dissolving into orgies, of demons entering their beds. These lurid accounts were not born of memory, but of coercion. The inquisitors repeated questions. What did he do to your body? How did it feel? Where did he touch you? Forced women to mouth narratives shaped by male desire and fear. In the end, the truth of the witch was nothing but a dark mirror reflecting the fantasies of her persecutors. Thus, the female body became a paradoxical icon, feared as dangerous, yet obsessed over in minute detail. Women were condemned for inciting desire, but that very desire was stoked and exploited by the process of their condemnation. What society sought to suppress, it magnified. What it punished, it relished. The witch was not a woman at all, but a symbol of collective anxiety, scapegoated for everything men feared in themselves. This paradox reveals a tragic cycle. The more the church condemned lust, the more it conjured images of it. By declaring sexuality a crime, society could not erase it. It only made it more alluring, more terrifying, more present. Witch trials became a grim carnival of repression, where the body was interrogated, stripped, tortured, and finally destroyed, yet desire itself lived on, haunting the very men who struck the matches at the stake. The lesson of this chapter is clear. The witch's body never existed. It was a fabrication born of fear and hunger, a projection of society's inability to reconcile with its own desires. Thousands of women were burned, drowned, or hanged, not because of who they were, but because of what others imagined them to be. Their bodies became mirrors onto which an age projected its darkest anxieties, then shattered them in fire and ash. The sexual demonology of the witch hunts in the medieval worldview. There was no clear boundary between theology, superstition, and imagination. To speak of witches was not only to speak of spells, curses, and poisons, but also of a vast and intricate demonology. At the heart of this terrifying doctrine lay a singular obsession: sex with the devil. Theologians, priests, and judges constructed an elaborate framework in which desire itself was proof of Satan's hand. Two figures appeared again and again in this discourse: the incubus and the succubus. The incubus, a male demon, was believed to creep into women's beds at night, forcing himself upon them, leaving them exhausted, marked, or even pregnant with monstrous offspring. The succubus, a female demon, preyed on men, draining their vitality, stealing their seed and leaving them weak, ill, or insane. These were not merely folk tales whispered around the hearth. They were codified in official texts and cited in courts of law. The clergy declared with certainty that demons could disguise themselves as lovers even as spouses too, seduce and defile. A man's nocturnal emission, a woman's erotic dream, a sudden sickness of the body, each became evidence of demonic assault. What we now recognize as natural physiology or sleep paralysis was in those centuries explained as the violent embrace of the devil. During trials, this demonology was not abstract. It became the official language of accusation. Women were forced under torture to confess that they had lain with incubi, describing encounters with shadowy men whose touch burned like fire, whose breath reeked of sulfur. Court scribes recorded obscene details, forcing victims to narrate acts they had never experienced. The result was a grim archive of confessions, each more lurid than the last, not reflections of reality, but scripts written by terror and enforced through pain. The paradox is chilling. While the church railed against lust, its records overflowed with descriptions of it. The very effort to suppress desire produced a flood of fantasies, sanctified as law. Confessions of witches read today like dark erotic fictions, more revealing of the interrogator's imagination than of any supposed Sabbath with Satan. This demonology also served as an explanation for every misfortune. A husband suddenly impotent, he'd surely been drained by a succubus, young woman pregnant out of wedlock, evidence of a pact with an incubus, a deformed child, proof of demonic blood. Witchcraft and sexual demonology became the universal answer to all that was feared or misunderstood. Worse still, these beliefs justified the machinery of torture. Since witches supposedly lay with demons, they would never confess willingly. Thus fire and iron were deemed necessary to break their pact. The rack, the pair of anguish. The witch's chair bristling with spikes, all instruments designed to force. Admissions of carnal communion with Satan, Each new confession confirmed the theology, each scream fortified belief. It was a closed circle fed by its own violence. But beneath the surface of this theology lies a disturbing truth. Demonology was not simply a doctrine of fear. It was also a doctrine of desire. The obsessive questioning about positions, sensations, and demonic embraces betrays not just horror, but fascination. The writings of inquisitors meant to be manuals of faith, often read like nightmarish erotica. In their attempt to purge desire, they recorded it, detailed it, and in some dark sense, preserved it. The tragedy of the witch hunts is that these ideas carried the weight of law. When a dream or a scar could be labeled as proof of intercourse with demons, no one was safe. Women in particular were trapped, for their bodies were already framed as doors through which Satan might enter. In such a world, to be female was itself a kind of evidence. And so, in the echoing chambers of medieval prisons, we hear confessions of midnight embraces with incubi, of trembling bodies taken against their will, of lust transcribed into law. These were not testimonies of truth, but the echoes of a society at war with its own desires. Sexual demonology was not just superstition. It was a mirror reflecting humanity's inability to live with the reality of its own hunger. The theater of torture and desire in the dim chambers of Europe's prisons, where the stench of damp stone mingled with the flicker of torches. The witch trials unfolded not only as legal proceedings but as performances. Torture was their stage, the human body their script, and pain itself the spectacle. These trials became a kind of theater of cruelty, where religion, fear, and repressed lust were acted out upon the flesh of the accused. Torture was never a last resort. It was the very heart of the process. Without torture, there was no confession. Without confession, there was no verdict. And without a verdict, there was no supposed victory of God over the devil. Thus, the instruments of agony became the bridge between accusation and execution. The logic was spelled out with chilling clarity in manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum. The witch serves the devil. Therefore, she will never confess unless compelled by force. Torture is thus necessary for the salvation of her soul. To save the spirit, the body had to be broken. This was the twisted paradox upon which an entire age of terror was built. But torture was more than procedure. It was spectacle. Sound of bones cracking on the rack, the shriek of a woman suspended by her wrists until her joints tore apart. These became part of a ritualized drama that etched fear into the minds of onlookers. The chamber of torture was not private. It was a place where authority displayed its power, where suffering was paraded as proof of righteousness. The female body, once again, was at the center of the stage. Devices such as the witch's chair, studded with spikes, the pair of anguish inserted into the mouth or elsewhere, or red-hot pincers used to tear flesh all, were designed not only to inflict pain but to sexualize humiliation. Stripped bare or left half-naked, women stood exposed under the eyes of judges, guards, and sometimes even the public. In this cruel spectacle, the body was doubly violated, physically ravaged, and visually possessed. Torture was not just domination. It was voyeurism disguised as law. Records describe interrogations filled with obscene repetition. Judges demanded women recount how the devil had touched them, what acts had been performed, what sensations they had felt. Meanwhile, the tools of torment pressed closer to their skin. Under fire and steel, victims cried out stories shaped less by memory than by suggestion. Each word they uttered was molded by the hunger of their tormentors. It was not truth that was spoken, but a script forced into being, part confession, part fantasy, all born of violence. Public executions extended this theater beyond the dungeon. On the day of burning, the square filled with crowds. A woman, her hair loose, body bound to the stake, screamed as flames climbed her dress. The mob watched as flesh blackened and shriveled, and priests declared the triumph of God. Yet the spectacle was more than piety. It was also entertainment, a gruesome show that both horrified and fascinated. Beneath the chants and prayers, there lurked the silent thrill of watching forbidden flesh consumed. Thus, torture and desire formed two faces of the same coin. On one side, denial. Desire condemned as sin, lust projected onto the devil. On the other, obsession. Endless questions about sex with demons. Endless inspections of naked bodies. Endless fascination with the very acts they claimed to abhor. The more society sought to banish desire, the more it staged in interrogations, in torture, in executions. The greatest tragedy was silence. The voices of women, broken by pain, were never truly heard. Their own truths were erased, replaced by words dictated through agony. What remains in the records are not testimonies, but performances scripts written by inquisitors and sealed by fire. Their bodies became texts inscribed with pain, then erased in smoke. What survived was not justice, but spectacle. It's not truth, but domination. The theater of torture and desire is therefore not just a chapter in medieval cruelty, is a warning. When sexuality is shackled to guilt, when power cloaks itself in the language of salvation, the body will always become a stage, and suffering a performance. Torture chambers and burning stakes reveal less about witches than about the fears of those who judge them. And in the echoes of their screams we still hear the truth. Desire cannot be destroyed by chains and fire. Suppressed, it only returns, darker and more monstrous, reborn in the shadows of those who deny it. Looking back across the darkest corridors of the witch hunts, a grim paradox emerges. The more medieval society denounced desire, the more it became consumed by it. Lust was never silenced in the trials. It was spoken of constantly, described in lurid detail, carved into parchment, but always framed as sin, shame, and crime. Chapter 1 revealed how the female body was turned into a battlefield. Women's very existence, beauty, independence, even a glance or a scar, was transformed into evidence of demonic possession. Desire was not allowed to remain personal. It was projected outward, twisted into a trap that condemned thousands of women to death. Chapter 2 exposed the obsessive sexual demonology that flourished under the guise of theology. Incubi and succubi became the explanation for every unexplained phenomenon in dreams. Pregnancies, illnesses, and deformities. Yet behind these doctrines we glimpse not just fear, but the repressed hunger of those who created them. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum did not banish lust. They documented it, fixated on it, and in doing so, immortalized it. Chapter 3 unveiled the theater of torture, where suffering was staged as proof of God's justice. The rack, the spiked chair, the burning stake, these were not only instruments of pain, but also instruments of spectacle. Women's bodies were stripped, violated, and destroyed, while the crowd and the court watched. Torture was framed as salvation, but in truth, it was possession violence masquerading as virtue. When these fragments are pieced together, the image that emerges is not simply one of superstition, but of power feeding on fear and desire. Witch hunts were not about witches, they were about control. By branding sexuality as sin, by turning desire into evidence, and by staging execution as holy triumph, church and state fortified their rule. The witch trials reveal humanity's deepest dread, that desire left ungoverned could overturn the structures of faith and order. To contain this dread, countless innocents were sacrificed in fire and silence. Yet perhaps the most haunting aspect is the absence of authentic voices. The women who suffered could not speak for themselves. Their words were dictated under agony, their stories erased in flames. What remains are confessions sculpted by torture, not truth. History was written in the ink of judges and priests, while the voices of the condemned dissolved into smoke. Their silence is the truest indictment of all. And so the question turns to us, the heirs of this history. Have we truly escaped these chains? When society still stigmatizes desire, when women's bodies remain objects of scrutiny and control, when laws or faith reach into the most intimate corners of human life, for we not in some shadowed form still staging witch hunts of our own? The darkest sexual trials of the witch hunts is not merely a chronicle of the past. It is a mirror held up to the present. It warns us that whenever desire is shackled by guilt, whenever power claims ownership of the body in the name of virtue, the machinery of persecution will return. It may not wear the same robes or wield the same torches, but it will speak the same language of fear. When the last flames of the stakes died down, when the final screams vanished into the night, what remained was not only ash, but a lesson carved into history. Desire cannot be burned away. It is part of us, inescapable, eternal. Deny it, and it turns monstrous. Accept it, and it may yet be reconciled with freedom and dignity. The witch hunts ended centuries ago, but their shadow endures. They remind us that the greatest danger does not come from demons in the night, but from the fear within ourselves and from the power that exploits that fear.